The archives from the winter of 1894 record many disappearances in the mountains of the border territory, but none as precise, as cold, and as incomplete as the case of the 18 hunters who entered the chamber of the White Elk Matriarch near Ridge Pass and never returned. This is the kind of sentence that appears underlined in red in the old reports from Grafton County, an isolated place among the dark elevations of the region that today would be part of eastern Montana. At the time, there was no definitive map, only trails marked by the memory of the elders, small clearings opened by the wind, and ravines where the sun was slow to touch the ground. The protagonist of this historical archive is not a man, but a group, 18 experienced hunters, men who knew the terrain, the smell of snow, the crack of frozen trees. Among them, the most notable in the records was Adrian Cole, then 43 years old, a widower, a former blacksmith from the village of Hollowridge. He had become the leader of the group not because of his strength or age, but because of a kind of quiet calm that contemporary accounts describe as a serenity that cannot be learned, only carried. Adrian lived with his 9-year-old daughter Miriam in a small wooden cabin near Elkline Creek. Local church records mention that Miriam used to accompany him to the edge of the trail every time he went hunting, holding a small blue handkerchief that belonged to her mother. It was a simple symbol, but one repeated so often in the accounts that it ended up in the official archives, as if it reflected the fragility of the time itself. The winter of 1894, however, was not a normal one. Weather reports from the region, few, irregular, and handwritten, indicate that it was one of the driest and coldest years of the decade. Supplies were low, and large animals had moved beyond the white hills that protected Ridge Pass. The community itself began to feel that survival would depend on hunting deeper into the valleys. It was in this context that the first official mention of the so-called White Elk Matriarch appeared, not as a legendary creature or folkloric symbol, but as an exceptionally old female, spotted by 2 shepherds in late November of that year. The fact was recorded in an administrative, almost clinical tone. Female elk, unusual, large size, light coat, moves near the high ravines, possible indication of a larger herd. For the community, that represented food for an entire month. For the hunters, it was the opportunity that could save that difficult season. Adrian Cole gathered the group in the shed next to the abandoned mill. There were familiar faces, brothers, cousins, neighbors who had grown up together in the same narrow valley. The decision to go to Ridge Pass was made quickly, but cautiously. According to Adrian's notebook, the itinerary would take 3 days to get there, 2 days of watching, and 3 days to return. Enough time to track the animals, slaughter the herd, and bring back sustenance. The village witnessed their departure. The children ran after the men to the edge of the open field, and Miriam held her blue handkerchief so tightly that the fabric remained crumpled in the photographic records of the time. That was the last confirmed image of the 18 hunters still together, still visible, still men. Little was known with certainty about the mountain trails, but there was one point mentioned repeatedly, both in civilian reports and in testimonies collected decades later: a natural cavity between rock formations known as the chamber, where many animals sought shelter, especially older females who led smaller herds. That was where Adrian and the others were headed. That was where they believed they would find the old white elk. The beginning of the trail was reconstructed from the tracks left in the snow, tracks that remained preserved for almost 2 days due to the intense cold. After that, everything disappeared into the solid whiteness of the valley. What intrigues historians to this day is not only the disappearance of the group, but a detail hidden in the last pages of the official county report, written by Sheriff Elias Hargrove 3 weeks after the disappearance. A detail that does not match the rest of the documentation. A detail crossed out and rewritten twice, as if the sheriff himself hesitated before recording it. A detail that opens this mystery like a poorly fitted door. The cavity found did not match the usual description of the chamber. There were no hunting marks, no tracks, no signs of permanence. However, there was something that shouldn't have been there. The report does not explain what that something was. It only indicates that it was deliberately placed there, as if it had been left to be found, not by chance, but as a final mark of those who were lost. And this is exactly where the silence of the archives begins. The remaining documents on the case of the 18 hunters do not begin on the mountain. They begin inside the houses, in the small gestures of a community that lived compressed between winter and necessity. It is there, in the seemingly mundane daily life, that one realizes that something was already out of place long before Ridge Pass. The village of Hollowridge, in 1894, had just over 150 permanent residents. The houses were made of dark wood, built on irregular stone foundations. At the end of November, smoke from the stoves formed a low layer above the roofs, mixed with a constant smell of damp wood and wet wool. Tax records show that almost every family owed something to the county. Winter spared no one. The routine was strict. At dawn, the women lit the stove and divided up what little there was: flour, salt, leftover salted meat, potatoes stored in dirt cellars. The children went to the small school run by the church, and the men divided their time between chopping wood, repairing fences, and heading out to the shorter hunting trails, where it was still possible to find rabbits, foxes, and a few isolated deer. Adrian Cole, according to the diary of one of his neighbors, was a man of precise habits. He woke up before sunrise, heated water for coffee, and only then called Miriam. He never raised his voice, but the way he arranged things, his coat, his bootlaces, his rifle leaning in the corner, conveyed a silent discipline. His daughter accompanied him to the small fence that marked the boundary of the property, always with her blue scarf wrapped around her hand. Accounts from the time mention that in the weeks leading up to the expedition to Ridge Pass, Adrian seemed more focused than usual. Not exactly distressed, but burdened with thought, as if he were doing invisible calculations all the time. How much salt was left, how much flour was left, how long the village would hold out if the hunt remained scarce. A statement collected 40 years later by a young researcher, the son of one of the boys who saw the hunters leave, contains a curious phrase attributed to Adrian. "A winter like this won't forgive us twice. Either we find something big now, or someone will start missing from the table." There is no way to verify whether the words are exact, but the tone echoes something that already appeared in the official records. The expedition was not just a bold gamble. It was, in a way, a last resort. Inside the homes of the other hunters, the scenario was repeated with minor variations. There were large families with 3 or 4 children. There were brothers who lived together. There was an older man, Jonah Pike, who had lived alone since the death of his wife and insisted on hunting so as not to depend on the charity of his neighbors. There were also 2 young brothers, Elias and Warren Loughton, only 19 and 21 years old, described as too quick with their words and too slow with their judgment by one of the local pastor's records. Amid this web of relationships, some details emerge like small cracks in the surface of normality. One of them appears in a fragmented letter written by the village teacher to her sister who lived in another county. In it, the teacher mentions that the boys were distracted in class and that the houses are different, quieter. Conversations stop when someone passes by. The phrase seems vague, but it indicates an atmosphere of tension that winter statistics cannot record. Another crack appears in Adrian's own notebooks. On one of the last pages before the expedition, he draws a line of mountains and marks a point with an X, noting next to it, North Pass, old reports of elderly female refuge. Check with Hargrove. Hargrove was the county sheriff. There is no record of a formal meeting between the two, but the official report indicates that news about the so-called White Elk began to circulate after 2 shepherds reported the sighting to the sheriff at the county administrative headquarters. How this information reached Hollowridge is unclear. What is known is that less than 2 weeks passed between the sighting and the hunters' meeting. During that interval, something changed in the village's nighttime routine. Late testimonies speak of discreet meetings in the shed next to the old mill, always after dusk. No one called it a council or assembly. They were just men sitting on makeshift benches, looking at poorly drawn maps, discussing routes and cargo weights. But some women in the village, interviewed decades later, remember something else. The look their husbands had when they returned from these conversations. A look that mixed determination and something that wasn't quite courage, but a kind of silent obligation, as if it had already been decided that someone would have to go, and that there was no option to refuse. Despite this, to the eyes of children and young people, it all still seemed part of an adventure story written by winter. The hunters were tall figures against the snow, carrying rifles and backpacks, talking in low voices about distant trails. Miriam, for example, reportedly told her teacher that, this time, Dad will bring back an animal so big that the barn will smell like meat all year long. It is a childish phrase, recorded in a note that the teacher kept without knowing that it would later be attached to the county file as contextual evidence. Before the disappearance, there were subtle signs that something in the plan was not as solid as it seemed. One of them went down in the records as a mere logistical detail. The weather began to change irregularly. Instead of continuous snowstorms, the valley began to alternate between days of pale skies and nights of bitter cold with short gusts of wind that swept the snow into low swirls. This made the tracks more difficult to read. Some experienced hunters mentioned to Adrian that it might be better to postpone the expedition for a few days, but there is no indication that the proposal was taken forward. Another sign comes from a brief internal conflict, remembered by one of the few men who was not included in the expedition. His name was Matthew Granger, a woodcutter who, in testimony years later, reported having argued with Adrian at the chapel door. "You're taking too many people," Granger reportedly said. 18 men leave too many tracks, too much noise. What if the herd runs away? 6 or 7 would be better, at most. According to Granger, Adrian replied that it was not just a matter of slaughtering the matriarch, but of ensuring that as much meat as possible was brought back at once. 6 men can find the animal, but they can't bring Winter back with them. This dialogue has never been confirmed by another witness, but Granger's name appears in the margin of one of the sheriff's documents, with the note, "Refused. Reason unclear." Whatever was said at that door left enough of an impression to be remembered decades later. The day before departure, Hollowridge experienced a kind of silence that the records cannot describe, but which infiltrates the memories of the survivors. The women sewed patches on coats, prepared small packages of stale bread and dried meat, and sewed religious medals hidden in the linings. The children circulated among the houses, trying to guess which parents would return first with good stories from the mountain. At night, the small chapel was more crowded than usual. The pastor said a short prayer, asking for protection for those who would climb the icy trails. Miriam, according to an indirect testimony, did not take her eyes off her father during the entire prayer, as if she were trying to capture every detail of his face there, under the dim light of the candles. That same night, Sheriff Hargrove finished recording the group's official departure notice in his book, including the names of each of the 18. At the bottom of the page, an almost unnoticed note. It was requested that, upon their return, they confirm the exact location of the cave that they say is used as a shelter by the female moose. Purpose: map update. It was a technical, bureaucratic concern, but one that today sounds strangely symbolic. The county wanted to turn what had until then been only rumor and oral tradition into coordinates. The next morning, Hollowridge watched the 18 set off. Their boots sinking into the snow, their thick coats, steam rising from their mouths like small, fast-moving clouds. The initial trail was familiar. The difficult stretch would come later, when the group left behind the last landmarks of the valley and entered the silent zone of Ridge Pass. The testimonies agree on one point. No one that morning imagined that this walk would be a definitive boundary between what the village knew about itself and what it would never be able to explain. What few noticed, however, was a simple, almost trivial detail, noted only by Miriam on a small piece of paper kept with the blue handkerchief. Today, Dad left without his little notebook. He said he wouldn't need to write anything up there. This small notebook was the same one Adrian used to record measurements, distances, hunting counts, and short phrases about the weather. For the first time in years, he left the notebook at home. And by all accounts, it was also the first time he climbed the mountain without anything to write down what would happen next. The rest of the story from here on was reconstructed without Adrian's direct voice, only with traces, fragmented accounts, and a handful of clues found in a place where, according to the county's own report, there were no signs of permanence. And it is in the absence of that notebook, that hand that wrote everything down, that the mystery begins to thicken around the chamber of the matriarch White Elk. Reconstructing the last journey of the 18 hunters is almost an archaeological task. There are no direct witnesses, no written accounts by those who were there, no complete maps of the trail. What exists are fragments, marks in the snow preserved for 2 days, testimonies collected weeks later, objects found out of place, and a raw silence that enveloped Hollowridge after the second night of absence. The initial trail to Ridge Pass was relatively well known. It was possible to follow a narrow path where the wind accumulated snow only in some sections. The hunters advanced in single file, alternating leadership to conserve energy. The first day showed no signs of danger. The crescent moon, recorded in the county's weather logs, discreetly illuminated the snow, and the loudest noise was just the constant crunching of boots freezing the top layer of soil. Early in the afternoon of the second day, however, tracks show that the group left the main trail and climbed a slope where the snow was thinner, almost crystallized. This decision coincides with the approximate point of the first sighting of the herd, or at least what they believe to be the herd. One of the few traces found in that area weeks later was a small piece of fabric stuck to a sharp rock. Records state that the fabric belonged to the coat of Jonah Pike, the oldest hunter. There was no blood, no sign of a serious fall. The cloth appeared to have been torn while passing through a narrow corridor of rocks. This indicated that the group had quickened their pace in an attempt to follow a clear trail. And there were clues. The sheriff's reports described deep, thick hoof marks, indicating a large animal, possibly the white-horned matriarch. But there was one troubling detail. The tracks led toward the chamber, but there were no signs of return. It was as if the animal had entered a more enclosed area and simply disappeared inside. The third day was reconstructed from weather patterns. Wind gusts cut across the mountain just before dawn, creating low whirlwinds that erased tracks and buried small clues. The hunters, however, would have been close to the chamber's entrance by that point. Analysis of the terrain indicates that at this point, they should have been crossing a zone of constant shade, where sunlight only touched the ground for a few minutes a day. There are no sound recordings from that morning, but later testimonies from other hunters in the region describe the kind of silence that dominates these valleys in winter. It is not an absence of noise, but a kind of natural muffling, as if the air was so heavy that even sound could not pass through it. For many, this silence is a sign that large animals are nearby. For others, it is simply winter closing the doors of the mountain. By mid-afternoon, the group would have reached the lower plateau of Ridge Pass. There, according to the official report, an extinguished campfire was found, surrounded by boot marks. But the fire had not been used for cooking. There was no grease, no utensils, no signs of a meal. Only partially burned sticks, as if the fire had been lit quickly to warm stiff hands or dry some equipment. The lack of food remains puzzled investigators at the time, but there is no evidence that this indicates anything unusual. In certain weather conditions, the priority was to keep the body warm, not to eat. What really caught the investigators' attention was something else. Near the fire, buried under 2 inches of fine snow, the volunteers found an unexpected object, a broken arrow. None of the 18 hunters carried bows. The entire group used rifles, as recorded in the house inventories. The arrow, made of old wood and rudimentary stringing, appeared to have decades of use, perhaps more. It was an object out of place in time, found among men who would never depend on such outdated weapons. The sheriff recorded the arrow as object unrelated to the case, but he made a curious addition. Possibly indigenous, though unusual in shape. This note, though vague, entered into later reports as one of the first pieces of evidence that the chamber was not as simple a shelter as the map suggested. By nightfall on the third day, the group should have reached the entrance to the cavity mentioned in the oral maps. This is where the narrative in the archives gains intensity. One of the last confirmed clues was found right there. The trail of a partially loaded sled, dragged across the snow and then abandoned. There was no damage, no signs of a struggle, no blood. Just the sled standing still, as if the group had decided to enter the chamber without taking anything. The decision is unusual. Hunters always keep their equipment close by, especially flashlights, blankets, and ammunition. From that point on, there are no more footprints, no sign of the group, no immediate traces of their stay. The snow around the chamber entrance remained untouched, leading investigators to believe that a sudden snowstorm had erased the signs shortly after the group entered. The entrance to the chamber, according to photographic records from the time, was a natural opening formed by two sloping rocks, creating a narrow corridor that widened a few meters ahead. Volunteers who attempted to enter report that there was a strong smell of damp earth and that the floor was uneven, with patches of dark frozen mud. But the sheriff's report mentions a detail that rarely appears in more modern summaries of the case. Inside the cavity, no signs of death were found, nor were there any remains of equipment or recent marks on the ground. However, in the center of the chamber, there was a single object, a narrow strip of leather, carefully folded. The leather, according to rudimentary analysis, appeared to be recent, and at the same time very worn. It was impossible to determine its origin. But the most important thing was not the material. It was the contents. Inside the leather strip, rolled up as if it had been hidden, was a small piece of paper, folded into 4 parts, protected from moisture. The paper initially confused investigators. It did not appear to be from Adrian's notebook, nor did it correspond to any of the other objects listed in the hunter's inventory. When opened, the note contained only one short sentence, written in the shaky handwriting of someone trying to record something under great pressure. Don't follow the mark. Nothing else. No name, no explanation. Just that sentence. Sheriff Hargrove noted in the report, note possibly from previous hunters. No direct connection proven. But the handwriting did not match any known documents from the time, nor did it resemble the writing of other men in the region. The search teams, baffled, tried to go beyond the chamber, but found only a narrow exit on the opposite wall, which seemed to lead to a deep slope. The access was so steep and so narrow that no volunteer was able to advance more than a few meters. The frozen mud there showed scratches, slide marks, and small cracks, as if something or someone had passed through, but in a disorderly manner. It was at this point that the tension in the archives reached its climax. One of the volunteers, the youngest member of the search team, claimed to have found a second note, stuck between 2 deeper stones in the corridor. This note was never found again. All that is known about it is the description given by the volunteer himself to the village pastor, who recorded the statement in writing. According to this indirect account, the note read, 18 went in, 18 saw, 18 could not return. The pastor's document was attached to the official file, but the sheriff never confirmed seeing the original note. In any case, after that point, the trail ends. The last marks, the last evidence, the last physical signs cease abruptly inside the chamber. The snow shows no exit, the slope shows no continuity, the mountain shows no struggle, fall, or attack. Nothing. It is as if, from that moment on, the 18 men had been swallowed up not by the earth, not by legend, not by something supernatural, but by the very emptiness of human and historical gaps. And that emptiness, however silent, always leaves one last detail behind. In the case of Matriarch White Elk's chamber, that detail was the sled abandoned at the entrance. When Sheriff Hargrove ordered the object to be collected, he found a very thin blue thread stuck under one of the straps. Children's fabric, handkerchief fabric. The same type of fabric that Miriam carried every morning when she accompanied her father. That was the last confirmed evidence in the case. And from there began the most unsettling part of the investigation. The community's reaction upon realizing there was no possible return. When the 18 hunters passed the point where the tracks ended, the mountain gave nothing back to the village for many days. And in Hollowridge, the absence began to take the form of a presence, a heavy, slow, almost physical presence, the kind of silence that fills kitchens, hallways, and porches, as if it were taking the place of the missing men. The first official reaction came 4 days after the estimated return date. Sheriff Elias Hargrove gathered volunteers, wrote down names, collected lanterns, ropes, and supplies, and set off with a group of 8 men toward the chamber. What they found, or failed to find, has already been reconstructed in the previous block. What matters now is what happened next. When Hargrove returned to the village 3 days later, bringing only the frozen sled and the 2 notes, the community gathered in the makeshift square in front of the mill. There were no cries, no running. The reaction was silent, incredibly silent, as if each person were listening to something only they could hear. The sheriff described the expedition objectively: the sled, the arrow, the absence of tracks, the empty chamber, the note on the leather strip. He described the second note, the one mentioned by the volunteer, as unconfirmed. Everything he said was noted by the pastor in his logbook, a logbook that still exists, preserved in a metal box in the Hollowridge church. But there is something that does not appear in the official report and only emerges in the testimonies given decades later: Miriam's face. According to oral accounts, she stood in front of the crowd, holding the blue handkerchief between her fingers. Upon hearing that nothing had been found, she clenched her hand around the fabric until her knuckles turned white. Then she reportedly uttered a single, almost inaudible sentence. "He must have written it down somewhere." That phrase resonated deeply with the residents, because everyone knew that Adrian wrote everything down. Everything, from the amount of firewood to the direction of the winds, from the trails to little notes about his daughter's health. A disappearance without a word from him seemed impossible, and in a way, it still does today. In the following weeks, other search teams were sent out. Some followed alternative routes around the mountain. Others tried to descend the steep slope behind the camera. None returned with concrete information. Nothing. No remains, no equipment, no marks, no clothes, no weapons. The mountain returned silence with the same integrity with which it returned cold. It was in this context that the rumors began, recorded informally in letters, conversations, and marginal notes. It is important to note that nothing in them points to supernatural elements. They are deeply human rumors, born of fear and lack of answers. The first rumor suggested that the group had split up inside the chamber, perhaps to explore different passages. This would explain the absence of footprints, but it would not explain why no one returned to the entrance. The second rumor said that by following the herd's tracks, the hunters could have reached an unstable plateau where the thin ice gave way. However, this theory was contested by investigators because there was no sign of collapse in the area near the chamber. The third rumor was the most disturbing. It spoke of a sign found by one of the volunteers and not officially recorded, something marked on the inner wall of the corridor. The volunteer never publicly confirmed this report, but later interviews suggest that he may have seen a kind of leather strap stuck between 2 rocks, similar to the one used to attach the note that was found. Apparently, there was nothing inside it. It was empty, but positioned as if waiting for something. None of these theories made it into the official reports. The county kept the case as a collective disappearance in a risk area, and nothing more. But the village was not satisfied with this dry label. As the weeks passed, life began to reorganize itself unevenly. Some families moved away before the end of winter. Others remained, trying to restore some semblance of routine. The women sewed. The remaining men chopped wood. The children played with strange intensity, as if they wanted to fill the space left by the absent adults. But Adrian's absence seemed to radiate in a particular way. Not because he was more important than the others, but because he represented a kind of silent center of that group. His absence generated echoes that reached the entire village. Miriam, according to acquaintances, began to attend church every day, sitting in the same pew where her father used to sit during services. The pastor noted that she would sit there for long periods of time, folding and unfolding her blue scarf repeatedly, as if trying to do with the fabric what her father did with his notebooks: organize the world. Sheriff Hargrove, under pressure from the county, wrote his final report 6 weeks after the disappearance. It was in this report that he added the phrase most discussed by historians to this day: "The cavity found does not match previous descriptions." It may be topographical confusion caused by snowfall. However, the position and condition of the objects collected indicate that someone placed them there intentionally. This addendum was crossed out and rewritten twice, as if Hargrove had hesitated to record it. The final text, however, remained in the public record, and it is in this crossed-out, rewritten and retained passage that many researchers see the embryo of the most plausible revelation of the case. Because there is a profound difference between lost objects and left objects. If the notes, especially the first one, the one on the leather strip, were left there, then they were not messages from desperate people. They were instructions, warnings, markings for navigators of the cold. And then the most solid, coherent, and painful human interpretation emerges. The men did not get lost. They tried to return, but they encountered something that made it impossible to return. Not because of mysticism, but because of geography, climate, and terrain. Perhaps a deep crevasse, perhaps an area of fragile ice covered by fresh snow, perhaps a sudden narrowing of the rocky corridor that collapsed after they passed through. There is no proof of what the obstacle was, but there is logic in the hypothesis that the group advanced through a passage that, shortly thereafter, became impossible to cross. This would explain the absence of marks at the entrance, the need to leave notes, the presence of the abandoned sled, and above all, the fact that nothing returned. The revelation in this case is not a solution. It is a recognition of the human dimension of the tragedy. They were trapped, with no way out, and the mountain closed behind them. It is a silent revelation which brings no relief, but it brings coherence. And it was this coherence that, according to reports, allowed Hollowridge to breathe again after months of suspended mourning. Not a sigh of acceptance, but of minimal understanding that, however inexplicable the disappearance was, it remained within the harsh laws of nature. Still, one question remained in the minds of the community, and remains alive in the archives. Who wrote the note, "Don't follow the trail"? And why would anyone have left it? Right in the center of an empty chamber. The surviving documents from the case of the 18 hunters have been reorganized many times over the decades. First, out of administrative necessity. Then, out of academic curiosity. Finally, out of a kind of silent respect, as if each piece of paper were the last link between Hollowridge and the men who disappeared in the mountains. Today, visitors to the small county archive find a wooden box darkened by time. Inside it lie the piece of blue fabric, the strip of leather hardened by the ancient cold, the shepherd's log, Sheriff Hargrove's crossed-out report, and a faded photograph of the village in the winter of 1894. Nothing else. No maps, no rifles, no personal items. Just these minimal fragments, and yet enough to sustain a century of questions. Over the years, the mountain has also changed. The entrance to the chamber, which was once exposed, has been partially buried by natural landslides. Today it is just a dark crack, too narrow to be explored safely. Geologists who visited it in the 1950s noted that the interior appears to have collapsed long ago, perhaps at the end of the winter of 1894 itself, perhaps right after the hunters passed through. If this is true, and there is no reason to believe it is not, then the mountain really did close behind them. Not as punishment, not as a supernatural mystery, not as a deliberate act of nature, but as a consequence of slow, silent forces that existed long before any human being climbed those ice corridors. Upon rereading all the records, it is striking that no document attempts to offer a definitive explanation. Not even the sheriff, who was the man responsible for responding to the county, attempted to piece together an absolute solution. He simply described the facts and, in the rewritten passages, let slip a doubt that would accompany him throughout his entire life. Surprisingly, this doubt is not about what happened inside the chamber. It is about what happened before. Why did Adrian leave the notebook at home? Why did the group decide to enter the cave, abandoning the sled? Why was the ancient arrow near the fire? And who wrote, in such a hurry, "Don't follow the mark"? The most human answer is perhaps the simplest. In extreme situations, decisions cease to be logical and become instinctive. Perhaps Adrian was trying to protect his daughter by leaving the notebook behind, preventing her from finding harsh descriptions of that winter's poverty in the future. Perhaps the men entered the chamber because the wind was too strong on the plateau. Perhaps the arrow was just an old object, lost by travelers from another era. Perhaps the note was a desperate attempt to warn the next group not to repeat the same mistake. But history, as the records show, rarely ends with perhaps. It ends with silence. A silence that spread through Hollowridge for many years afterward. Families reorganized their lives, buried absences, rebuilt homes, opened new trails. Miriam grew up, moved decades later to an aunt's house in a neighboring county, and, according to baptism records, became a teacher, perhaps trying in some way to keep her father's habit of recording the world alive. The pastor died in 1918, and his notebook remained in the chapel until it was collected by the Historical Archive. Sheriff Hargrove retired in 1907. It is said that he visited the mountain one last time, alone, 2 weeks before handing in his badge. There is no record of this visit, but there is a note kept by his family containing only 2 lines written in the same firm handwriting as his report. The camera did not hide answers. It only showed the limits of what we can know, and it is precisely this limit that makes the case of the Ridge Pass hunters so enduring. There is no myth. There is no legend. There is no extraordinary explanation. There is only the weight of human decisions, the harshness of winter, the fragility of the trails, and the silence that settles in when nature closes a door that should never have been opened. Modern researchers, when analyzing the case, have come to a discreet, almost melancholic conclusion. The mystery persists not because it is profound, it persists because it is incomplete. It was built by gaps, by fragments, by missing pages, by displaced objects, by belated testimonies. It is not inexplicable. It is unattainable. And perhaps that is the true heart of the story. Not the disappearance itself, but the certainty that some narratives remain suspended in time because there are not enough hands to hold them back to the ground. These are stories that continue to exist only in the gap between what is known and what can no longer be discovered. Walking around Ridge Pass today, the wind still creates low swirls, like those that erase the hunter's tracks. The snow covers everything with the same ancient calm, and the stones retain a cold that has not changed since the 19th century. If one stays there long enough, one may understand what the archives try to say without saying, that the mountain never returns exactly what it takes. That absence can occupy space for decades, and that certain names, Adrian, Jonah, Elias, Warren, and all the others, remain alive not because they were found, but because they were never stopped being sought. The case ends like this, with documents stored in boxes, with memories dissolved between generations, and with a question that echoes without finding a wall to bounce off. What if they really tried to warn us? The echo of that question even today is what keeps the story open, and it is that question and that question alone that closes this account. And the screen now must remain silent.